Dad regretted marrying you. My son said it so casually during the reading of my husband's will that for a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The conference room at Green and Howell Attorneys suddenly felt too small, too warm. The air thick with the scent of stale coffee and polished mahogany. My fingers tightened around the leather strap of my purse while the attorney sitting across from us slowly removed his glasses, clearly pretending not to notice the silence that followed. My daughter-in-law Vanessa lowered her eyes for exactly 1 second before taking a sip of sparkling water, hiding the small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. My husband Richard had been dead for 9 days. 9 days since I stood beside his hospital bed holding his hand while the machines beeped softly in the dark. 9 days since 43 years of marriage ended with one long breath leaving his body forever. And now our son was sitting across from me in a navy blue suit Richard himself had paid for last Christmas, telling me that his father regretted marrying me. Daniel, I whispered quietly, more confused than angry. What are you talking about? He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, avoiding my eyes exactly the way he had been doing since the funeral. Dad told me everything near the end, he said flatly. He said he wasted too many years trying to hold this family together. Vanessa gently touched his wrist as if supporting him through some terrible emotional burden. We're only trying to make things easier for everyone, Eleanor, she added softly in that careful voice she used whenever she wanted to sound compassionate. I looked at her manicured nails resting against my son's hand, and suddenly remembered the first time Richard met her 8 years ago. He had smiled politely through dinner, but later that night while we washed dishes together, he quietly asked me, "Doesn't she seem a little too interested in what people own?" At the time I laughed it off. I thought he was being overprotective. I thought love would smooth out all sharp edges eventually. I was wrong. Attorney Harold Green cleared his throat awkwardly and opened the file in front of him. "Perhaps we should continue with the formal reading," he said carefully. But Daniel wasn't finished. "Dad was unhappy for years, Mom," he continued coldly. "You just never noticed because you were too busy pretending everything was perfect." The words settled into my chest slowly, like cold rain soaking through heavy fabric. Strange thing was I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply folded my hands together in my lap and stared at the gold wedding ring still resting on my finger. Richard had placed it there in the spring of 1979 outside a tiny church in Vermont while rain poured down so hard we could barely hear the minister speaking. Richard Whitmore was many things in his lifetime. Stubborn, proud, quiet, but he was not cruel. And deep down, somewhere beneath the grief crushing my ribs, I knew something didn't fit. Because during the final months of his life, Richard had started watching Daniel differently. Like a man silently studying cracks spreading through the walls of his own home. Then Harold slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me. "Your husband instructed me personally to give you this after the reading," he said. Daniel's expression changed instantly. Vanessa stopped smiling. And for the first time that morning, I realized my husband may have known exactly what was coming long before any of us did. The drive home from the attorney's office took 23 minutes. But it felt much longer with the envelope sitting unopened beside me on the passenger seat. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as I guided my silver Buick through the quiet suburban streets of Fairfield County, past grocery stores Richard used to complain were overpriced and restaurants where we celebrated anniversaries that now felt like scenes from another woman's life. My hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but inside, something heavy had shifted. Daniel's words kept replaying in my mind with cruel precision. "Dad regretted marrying you." I had spent 43 years beside Richard Whitmore. I knew the sound of his footsteps before he reached the front door. I knew how he folded towels too neatly, and how he hated cold coffee but drank it anyway whenever he became distracted reading financial reports at the kitchen table. I knew the exact look on his face whenever he was worried but trying to hide it from me. And during the last year of his life, Richard had been worried often. At the time, I assumed it was his heart condition getting worse. Now I was no longer sure. The house greeted me with the same silence that had followed me since the funeral. Large homes become strange places after loss. Every room feels too wide. Every clock sounds louder. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and slowly removed my coat while the grandfather clock near the staircase chimed 4 times. The scent of Richard's cedar aftershave still lingered faintly in the hallway closet, and for one painful second I closed my eyes just to breathe it in. Upstairs, his side of the bathroom remained untouched. His reading glasses still rested beside the sink exactly where he left them the morning before his final hospital stay. I stood there staring at them while memories drifted through my mind in quiet fragments. Richard watering roses every Sunday morning. Richard asleep in his recliner during football games. Richard insisting every Thanksgiving that nobody made pecan pie better than mine. Unhappy for years? No, that was not the man I married. But Daniel believed it. Or worse, he wanted me to believe it. I carried the envelope into the kitchen and placed it carefully on the table without opening it. Something about it unsettled me. Harold Green had looked nervous handing it over, and Vanessa's expression had changed too quickly for me to miss. I poured myself coffee that had gone cold hours earlier and sat near the window overlooking the backyard. Richard built that deck himself 15 years ago during one brutally hot July. I remembered standing outside with lemonade while he laughed at his own terrible measuring mistakes. He had always laughed easily back then. My eyes drifted toward the detached garage across the yard, and that was when I noticed the side door slightly open. My stomach tightened immediately. Richard never left doors open. Ever. Setting down my coffee, I grabbed my cardigan and stepped outside into the damp afternoon air. The gravel driveway crunched softly beneath my shoes as I crossed toward the garage. Inside, everything appeared normal at first. Richard's old toolbox sat beneath the workbench. Fishing rods hung neatly along the wall. But then I noticed the empty space on the shelf near the back cabinet. The wooden watch box was gone. My chest tightened. Richard's Rolex had been inside that box. The same watch his father gave him the day he opened Whitmore Construction in 1984. Daniel knew how much that watch meant to him. Slowly, I walked back toward the house as cold rain brushed against my face. And for the first time since Richard died, a terrible thought entered my mind. Maybe my son had already started taking things long before the will was ever read. I did not mention the missing watch to Daniel that evening when he called. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table listening to his voice drift through the speaker of my cell phone, while darkness slowly settled outside the windows. Vanessa found a realtor who specializes in estate properties, he said casually. You should probably think about downsizing before winter, Mom. A place this big is too much for one person. Too much for one person. The same house where I raised him. The same house where Richard carried him downstairs on Christmas mornings while pretending Santa forgot his own coffee upstairs. I stared at the untouched envelope beside my elbow. I am not making any decisions right now, I answered quietly. Daniel sighed the way exhausted parents do with difficult children. You cannot stay stuck in the past forever. Before I could respond, Vanessa's voice floated faintly through the phone in the background. Ask her about the lake property. My stomach tightened instantly. Richard's lake cabin in Vermont had belonged to his family for nearly 60 years. Daniel knew better than anyone how fiercely Richard protected that place. We are just trying to help, Daniel added quickly. Dad would have wanted things handled efficiently. Efficiently. Such a cold word for dismantling someone's entire life. After we hung up, I remained at the kitchen table long after my coffee turned bitter and cold. The envelope still sat unopened beside me, but somehow opening it felt final, as though whatever truth waited inside would permanently divide my life into before and after. Around 6:12 the next morning my phone rang. The sharp sound startled me awake from the recliner in Richard's study where I had apparently fallen asleep sometime after midnight. Confused and stiff, I reached for the phone on the side table. Mrs. Whitmore? A man asked quietly. This is Leonard Briggs. I handled accounting for Whitmore Construction for nearly 20 years. I sat upright immediately. Leonard retired 3 years ago, shortly after Richard sold part of the company. Is everything all right? I asked cautiously. There was a long pause on the other end. I need to speak with you privately, he said finally. Not with Daniel present. A strange heaviness settled in my chest. Why? Another pause. Then his voice dropped lower. Because Richard asked me to call you if anything happened to him. The room suddenly felt colder. Morning light filtered weakly through the curtains while I stared at the framed photograph on Richard's desk. It had been taken at the lake cabin 5 summers ago. Richard stood beside Daniel smiling proudly while Vanessa wore oversized sunglasses and leaned against the dock railing with one perfectly polished hand resting on my son's shoulder. Looking at the picture now, I noticed something unsettling. Richard was smiling at the camera, but his eyes looked tired. "Mr. Briggs," I whispered carefully, "what exactly did my husband ask you to do?" "There is a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Hartford," he replied. "Richard left instructions with the bank manager. Only you can access it now." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What is inside?" "Documents," Leonard answered quietly. "Financial records, trust paperwork, and a handwritten letter addressed to you personally." My pulse quickened. Why would Richard hide those things from Daniel? Silence lingered long enough for me to hear Leonard exhale slowly. "Because near the end," he said carefully, "your husband became concerned that Vanessa was influencing your son in ways he could not control." I closed my eyes as memories began surfacing all at once. Vanessa asking strange questions about Richard's investments during holiday dinners. Daniel suddenly pressuring Richard to sell assets faster than planned. The arguments I overheard behind closed office doors last spring when Daniel thought I was upstairs asleep. "Richard believed someone was moving money," Leonard continued softly. "And before he died, he wanted to make certain you were protected." I looked again at the sealed envelope resting beside me on the desk. Suddenly it no longer felt frightening. It felt important. Because for the first time since the funeral, I realized my husband may not have left me defenseless after all. Sleep became impossible after Leonard Briggs called. Every corner of the house felt crowded with memories that no longer fit together the way they once had. By Thursday afternoon, rain clouds had cleared over Fairfield County, leaving pale sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors while I wandered slowly from room to room trying to understand when exactly my family had begun slipping away from me. The strange part about betrayal is that it rarely arrives all at once. It enters quietly, through missed phone calls and changed traditions and conversations that suddenly stop when you walk into the room. Standing in the kitchen beside the old white refrigerator Richard insisted on repairing himself every few years, I found myself remembering Daniel at age 8, sitting barefoot at the counter eating cereal before school while telling me very serious stories about becoming an astronaut someday. He used to follow me everywhere when he was little. Grocery stores, church picnics, hardware stores with Richard on Saturday mornings. He once cried for an entire hour because I left him with my sister for one evening while Richard took me to dinner for our anniversary. "I just like it better when everybody is home," he said through tears back then. Somewhere along the way, home stopped including me. I think the first real shift happened after Vanessa entered our lives. She arrived polished and charming with perfect blonde hair and soft, careful manners that impressed everyone immediately. Their engagement dinner, she brought expensive wine and complimented my cooking 3 separate times. Richard thanked her politely afterward, but later that night while folding laundry he quietly said, "That girl studies people too carefully." I laughed at him at the time. I told him he was imagining things because he had spent too many years negotiating contracts and distrusting everyone around money. But slowly tiny things began changing. Sunday dinners became harder to schedule. Holidays suddenly rotated toward Vanessa's family every year. Daniel stopped calling just to talk. Then came the cancellations. Vanessa already made plans. "Vanessa thinks we should keep Christmas small this year." Vanessa booked a couple's trip that weekend. Everything became about what Vanessa preferred. Even Richard noticed it more as time passed. Last Thanksgiving, I spent 3 hours cooking while Daniel texted 30 minutes before dinner saying they would not make it because Vanessa had a migraine. Later that night, I saw photos online of them attending a rooftop party in Boston with friends. Richard stared silently at those pictures for a long time before closing his tablet without saying a word. Another memory surfaced while I stood beside the sink. About 6 months ago, Richard and Daniel argued in the study after dinner. Their voices stayed low, but tension carried through the walls like static electricity. I only caught fragments. "This is not your money yet. You do not understand how difficult things are right now." I said no, Daniel. When I entered the room carrying coffee, both men instantly stopped talking. Vanessa appeared moments later with that same practiced smile she always wore when controlling a situation. "Family stress is so exhausting at our age," she told me gently while touching my arm as though comforting a fragile patient instead of her mother-in-law. Looking back now, I realized something painful. Vanessa never pushed me out openly. She erased me gradually, carefully, patiently, like someone removing old photographs from an album one picture at a time, hoping nobody would notice the empty spaces until it was too late. And perhaps the worst part was understanding that Richard saw it happening long before I did. That explained the tiredness in his eyes during those final months, the quiet tension beneath his smile, the way he started double-checking bank statements late at night after everyone else had gone home. By the time evening settled over the house again, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Richard had not spent his last year worrying about death. He had spent it preparing for what would happen to me after he was gone. Friday arrived gray and cold. The kind of October morning where the trees outside looked faded beneath low clouds hanging over the neighborhood. I barely touched breakfast before Daniel's black SUV pulled into the driveway at exactly 9:15. He used to arrive early whenever he visited, usually carrying bagels or coffee and apologizing for traffic before kissing my forehead. That version of my son felt very far away now. Vanessa stepped out first wearing a cream-colored coat and dark sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Daniel followed carrying a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Neither of them smiled when I opened the front door. "We do not want to take up too much of your day," Vanessa said pleasantly as she walked inside without waiting to be invited. Her eyes immediately scanned the living room the way realtors inspect square footage. Daniel removed his coat slowly and placed the folder on the dining room table where I once hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 14 people. "Mom, we need to settle some paperwork before things become complicated," he said. Complicated. Another cold business word wrapped around grief. I remained standing quietly while Vanessa walked toward the kitchen island and rested perfectly manicured fingers against the marble countertop Richard installed for our 25th anniversary. "This house is worth much more now than people realize," she said casually. "The market in Fairfield County is still very strong." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Richard built this kitchen himself." Vanessa offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Exactly. Which is why buyers will love it." Daniel opened the folder and slid several documents across the table toward me. "The attorney already reviewed everything," he explained quickly. "These forms would allow us to list the property sooner instead of waiting through probate delays." I glanced down at the papers without touching them. Legal language covered every page in dense paragraphs I did not fully recognize. Transfer authorization, temporary estate management, limited power assignment. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Richard once told me that people become dangerous when they rush you to sign something. "You can trust us," Vanessa added softly. "We are trying to protect you from unnecessary stress." Protect me? The woman had spent years quietly removing me from my own family gatherings, and now she spoke to me like a social worker handling an elderly stranger. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Dad wanted things handled efficiently after he passed. You know how he hated loose ends." I studied my son carefully then. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His jaw looked tense. For the first time, I wondered if pressure was building somewhere beneath his coldness too. "Why are you in such a hurry to sell?" I asked quietly. Vanessa answered before Daniel could speak. "Because maintaining a property this size is expensive, Eleanor. Taxes alone are nearly $20,000 a year." There it was again. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitmore. Eleanor. Detached. Clinical. Like speaking to someone already halfway erased. I slowly picked up the first document and pretended to read while silence settled over the room. In truth, my attention drifted toward the envelope still hidden upstairs inside Richard's desk drawer. Toward the safety deposit box waiting in Hartford. Toward the uneasy realization that my husband may have spent months preparing me for this exact moment. "I would like copies of everything first," I said calmly at last. Vanessa's expression flickered for half a second before smoothing itself again. Daniel sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, this does not need to turn into a battle." Battle. Such an interesting word to choose. I placed the papers neatly back onto the table and folded my hands. Together. Then nobody should rush me. The room fell silent after that. Outside, cold wind rattled branches against the dining room windows while Vanessa stared at me with an expression I had never fully seen before. Not annoyance. Not frustration. Calculation. And somehow deep in my chest, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were afraid of something they thought I still did not know. The following Monday, I drove to Hartford alone beneath a pale autumn sky while golden leaves gathered along the edges of Interstate 84 like scattered pieces of old paper. Richard always preferred driving himself whenever we visited the bank downtown, usually humming softly to classic jazz while tapping the steering wheel with one hand. That morning, the passenger seat beside me remained painfully empty. First National Bank occupied the corner of an old granite building near the river, elegant and quiet in the way wealthy institutions often are. Inside, polished marble floors reflected warm yellow light from antique chandeliers, while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. A young teller directed me upstairs after I gave Richard's name. "Mrs. Whitmore," the bank manager said gently when she greeted me outside a private office. "Mr. Whitmore left very specific instructions regarding your visit." Her name was Patricia Sloane. Mid-60s perhaps, silver hair pulled neatly behind one ear, the kind of composed professionalism Richard always respected. She offered coffee but I declined. My stomach had been tight all morning. Patricia unlocked a narrow security room herself and guided me toward a long row of steel safety deposit boxes lining the walls. "Your husband updated the authorization 6 months ago," she explained quietly. "Only you have access now." 6 months ago. Around the same time Richard began checking financial statements late at night. Around the same time arguments with Daniel became more frequent behind closed doors. Patricia slid a small brass box onto the table in front of me and discreetly stepped outside to give me privacy. For several seconds I simply stared at the key trembling faintly in my hand. Then I opened it. Inside rested 3 thick folders secured with black clips, several bank statements, a flash drive, and one sealed ivory envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. "Eleanor." My chest tightened immediately. I reached for the envelope first. Richard always pressed hard when writing by hand, each letter slightly slanted the way they taught in Catholic schools during the 1960s. Carefully I opened the seal. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I was not able to fix things before leaving you alone to carry them." I stopped breathing for a moment. Outside the small room, distant footsteps echoed softly across marble floors while Richard's voice seemed to rise from the paper itself. Over the last year, I began noticing financial discrepancies connected to Daniel and several transfers requested through company channels that did not make sense. When I questioned him, Vanessa always appeared with explanations before he could answer himself. I felt my pulse quicken as I continued reading. I wanted to believe our son was simply overwhelmed by debt and pressure. But eventually I realized something much worse. He was hiding things from us. From you especially. Tears blurred the ink briefly before I forced myself to continue. "I have spent months restructuring assets and protecting accounts that cannot legally be touched without your direct approval. The lake property, investment accounts, and the Fairfield house are now secured through the Whitmore Family Trust. Daniel does not know the full details. Neither does Vanessa." My hands trembled harder now. Beneath the letter rested copies of trust documents bearing Richard's signature alongside legal stamps from months earlier. Irrevocable trust. Primary beneficiary, Eleanor Whitmore. Secondary review clauses activated upon evidence of financial coercion or estate manipulation. I stared down at the words while understanding settled slowly into place. Richard had not merely prepared a will before dying. He had built defenses. Quietly. Carefully. Methodically. There was one final handwritten paragraph near the bottom of the letter. "Eleanor, if Daniel pressures you after I am gone, do not sign anything quickly no matter what he says. And whatever happens, remember this clearly. I never regretted loving you." I closed my eyes then, pressing the letter gently against my chest while grief and relief collided somewhere deep inside me. Because for the first time since the funeral, I finally understood why Daniel and Vanessa were in such a hurry. They were racing against protections they did not know existed. By the time I returned home from Hartford, the late afternoon sun had faded into a dull silver haze over the neighborhood, and something inside me had changed permanently. Grief still lived inside my chest like a heavy stone, But it no longer felt directionless. Richard had left me more than memories. He had left me warnings. That evening, I locked the front door carefully and carried the folders from the safety deposit box upstairs to his study. The room smelled faintly of old leather and cedarwood polish, exactly the way it always had whenever Richard spent late nights reviewing company reports. I sat behind his desk for the first time since the funeral and slowly opened the first folder. Pages of financial records spread across the desk beneath the soft yellow light of the banker's lamp. First, the documents seemed routine. Account summaries, investment statements, tax records. Then patterns began emerging. Large transfers had moved quietly through several business accounts over the last 18 months, all authorized under temporary operational expenses connected to Whitmore Construction Holdings. But the destinations did not match company vendors. Many led toward shell consulting firms with vague names registered out of New Jersey and Delaware. My stomach tightened as I continued reading. One company name appeared repeatedly beside transfer amounts ranging from $12,000 to nearly $80,000 at a time. Bellcrest Advisory Group. I flipped through more pages until I found handwritten notes in Richard's familiar block lettering. Vanessa connected here. Verify before confronting Daniel. My pulse slowed into an icy calm. There were copies of emails too. Short exchanges between Daniel and financial managers discussing urgent liquidity issues and requests to delay internal reviews. Richard had highlighted entire sections in yellow marker. One sentence stood out sharply enough to make my chest ache. Vanessa says once the estate settles, everything will balance out anyway. Estate settles. They had been counting on Richard's death before it even happened. I pushed away from the desk and walked toward the window overlooking the backyard. Darkness had fully settled outside now, reflecting my own face faintly in the glass. Older, more tired, but no longer confused. Suddenly, dozens of moments from the past 2 years rearranged themselves into terrible clarity. Vanessa insisting Richard did not need outside accountants anymore. Daniel pressuring him to simplify ownership structures. Their constant interest in property values. Their sudden urgency after the funeral. None of it was grief. It was anticipation. My phone buzzed against the desk, startling me. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Eleanor, she said sweetly. Daniel and I were thinking maybe we should have dinner tomorrow night. We really want everyone feeling united right now. United. The woman sounded like a politician preparing for a campaign photograph. Tomorrow may not work, I answered calmly. Oh. A brief pause followed. Well, we are just worried about you being alone with all this paperwork. Legal matters can become overwhelming at your age. At your age. I almost smiled. Richard used to say people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they already have power. I appreciate the concern, I replied softly. But Richard taught me more about our finances than you realize. Silence greeted that sentence for nearly 2 full seconds. Then Vanessa laughed lightly, but something nervous flickered beneath it. Of course, she said quickly. We are all just trying to honor Richard's wishes. Richard's wishes. If only she knew. After we hung up, I opened the second folder and found copies of internal audit requests Richard had quietly ordered 6 months before his death. Several pages near the back carried handwritten annotations from Leonard Briggs himself. Potential unauthorized movement of funds tied to Daniel Whitmore approval chain. Recommend immediate freeze if trust activation occurs. I stared at those words for a long time while the house settled quietly around me. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 9. And for the first time since my husband died, I no longer felt like the frightened widow they expected me to be. Because now I understood something Daniel and Vanessa still did not. Richard had already seen them coming long before either of them realized he was watching. The next morning, I woke before sunrise for the first time in weeks without feeling lost. The house remained quiet around me while pale blue light slowly crept through the curtains of Richard's study. I wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee and stared down at the documents spread across the desk one final time before making the call that would change everything. Margaret Ellis answered on the second ring. Richard hired Margaret nearly 20 years ago during a corporate land dispute involving Whitmore Construction. Sharp-minded, composed, and impossible to intimidate, she built a reputation handling high-asset trust litigation throughout Connecticut. Richard admired her because she never wasted words. Eleanor, she said after listening quietly to everything I explained, do not sign anything. Do not transfer anything. And most importantly, do not warn them. 2 hours later, I sat across from her inside a corner office overlooking downtown Hartford, while rain streaked softly against the windows behind her desk. Margaret reviewed every document from the safety deposit box with careful precision, occasionally marking pages with yellow tabs while saying very little. The silence itself unsettled me more than panic would have. Finally, she removed her glasses and folded her hands together. Your husband was far more prepared than most people in situations like this, she said calmly. The Whitmore Family Trust gives you immediate authority to freeze several categories of asset movement if financial manipulation is suspected. My pulse slowed. You mean Daniel cannot access anything? Not without triggering review procedures, she replied. And based on these audit notes, your husband anticipated exactly this type of pressure after his death. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city while I absorbed the weight of those words. Richard had not spent his final year surrendering to illness. He had been protecting me quietly behind the scenes while pretending everything remained normal. Margaret slid another document toward me. There is more. The page listed several unauthorized transfers tied to Bellcrest Advisory Group alongside personal expenditures, hidden within company operational expenses. Luxury travel, credit consolidation payments, high-end retail purchases. Many approved under temporary executive authorizations connected to Daniel's credentials. But what stopped me cold was the handwritten notation attached to one highlighted transfer. Destination account linked to Vanessa Whitmore personal liability settlement. I looked up slowly. What does that mean? Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral. It means your daughter-in-law appears to have used company channels to resolve personal debt obligations. Suddenly, dozens of conversations replayed differently in my mind. Vanessa insisting they were struggling financially despite expensive vacations. Daniel abruptly pushing Richard to liquidate properties faster. Their obsession with the Fairfield house after the funeral. They were not grieving. They were cornered. Margaret continued speaking calmly. I recommend immediate temporary restrictions on trust-connected properties and account access until a full review is completed. Can Daniel challenge that? I asked quietly. Eventually, perhaps, she answered. But not before we force disclosure. Disclosure. Such a clean word for exposing betrayal. By noon, official notices were already moving quietly through legal channels. Temporary restrictions. Asset review triggers. Internal financial examination requests. No lawsuits yet. No accusations. Just enough pressure to stop them from moving anything else while Margaret prepared the next stage carefully. Richard would have appreciated her precision. When I returned home later that afternoon, a black SUV I did not recognize sat parked across the street beside the curb. Two men in jackets carrying measuring equipment walked slowly around my front yard taking notes while another photographed the exterior of the house. Contractors. Vanessa had already started preparing renovations before the estate even settled. I remained inside the car watching them for several long seconds before pulling into the driveway. One of the men approached politely. Afternoon, ma'am. We are here for preliminary estimates. Who hired you? I asked calmly, though I already knew the answer. Mrs. Whitmore. He smiled casually. Vanessa Whitmore. For one brief moment, anger flickered sharply through me. Not loud anger. Not explosive anger. Something colder. More focused. Because standing there beneath the gray October sky, watching strangers measure windows Richard installed with his own hands, I finally understood exactly how certain Daniel and Vanessa had been of winning. They thought I was grieving too deeply to notice what they were doing. They thought age made me weak. They thought silence meant surrender. And none of them realized that by tomorrow morning, the entire game was about to change. Daniel called at 7:30 the next morning, sounding irritated before I even answered. Why are there restrictions on the estate accounts? He demanded immediately. No greeting. No concern. Just anger sharpened by panic. I stood at the kitchen window watching fog drift slowly across the backyard while stirring cream into my coffee. Good morning to you too, I replied calmly. Silence crackled through the line. Then Vanessa's voice appeared faintly in the background asking him what I said. "Mom, the bank contacted us this morning," Daniel snapped. "Apparently some kind of review process has frozen access to several trust assets. The contractors cannot even move forward now." Contractors. Again. Not memories. Not family keepsakes. Contractors. "That is unfortunate," I answered softly. "Do not do this," he warned quietly. "We are trying to help you." For a moment, I closed my eyes and remembered the little boy who once brought me dandelions from the backyard because he thought they looked like tiny suns. I wondered where that child had gone. "No, Daniel," I said finally. "You are trying to control something that was never yours." The line went completely silent after that. Then came the knock at the front door barely 40 minutes later. Daniel and Vanessa stood outside together beneath the cold October sky, both dressed too formally for a casual visit. Vanessa clutched a leather handbag tightly against her side while Daniel's jaw remained rigid with tension. "We need to talk," he said the moment I opened the door. I stepped aside quietly and allowed them inside. The house felt strangely calm that morning, almost as though Richard himself were standing somewhere nearby watching everything unfold exactly as he expected it would. Daniel paced near the fireplace while Vanessa remained seated stiffly at the dining room table. "This legal interference stops today," Daniel said sharply. "You have no idea how complicated this makes things financially." "Actually," another voice answered calmly from the hallway, "she understands far more than you realize." Both of them turned instantly as Margaret Ellis stepped into the room carrying a black leather portfolio beneath one arm. Vanessa's face drained of color so quickly it startled even me. Daniel froze completely. "Who is this?" he demanded. Margaret offered a polite professional smile. "Margaret Ellis, counsel representing Eleanor Whitmore and the Whitmore Family Trust." The room fell deathly quiet. Outside, wind rattled dry leaves across the front porch while Margaret calmly placed several folders onto the dining room table. "Before we continue," she said evenly, "you should both know that unauthorized financial activity tied to multiple estate-connected accounts is currently under formal review." Daniel stared at the paperwork without touching it. "What unauthorized activity?" Margaret opened one folder and slid several highlighted documents toward him. "Transfers connected to Bellcrest Advisory Group. Executive authorizations processed through your company credentials. Personal liabilities linked to Vanessa Whitmore." Vanessa's breathing visibly changed. "This is ridiculous," she whispered quickly. "Those were legitimate consulting expenses." "Then I am certain the investigators will appreciate your cooperation," Margaret replied calmly. Daniel looked at me then for the first time since entering the house. Not with anger. Not even betrayal. Fear. Real fear. I sat quietly at the head of the dining room table where Richard and I once hosted Christmas dinners, while sunlight slowly filled the room around us. "Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice softer now, "you are blowing this completely out of proportion." I studied my son for several long seconds before answering. "Your father spent his final year protecting me from this exact moment." Vanessa suddenly pushed back her chair. "Richard manipulated her," she snapped before catching herself too late. Margaret slowly opened another folder. "Actually," she said evenly, "Richard Whitmore left very detailed written instructions." Then she slid his handwritten letter across the table directly toward Daniel. I watched my son's hands tremble slightly as his eyes moved over the page. And when he finally reached the final sentence, all color disappeared from his face completely. Because the last line Richard ever wrote was painfully simple. "I never regretted loving Eleanor. I regretted trusting people who mistook kindness for weakness."